Hello everybody and welcome for another webinar in the Mobycon Webinar Series. Today we're talking about roundabouts, a very exciting topic, and we'll be hearing from our design expert Eveline de Jong. She'll be joining us in a minute to talk you through the principles of roundabout design. Before we start, a few household announcements. We'll be using Mentimeter again, so if you can go to grab one of your devices and go to menti.com, the code will show up on the PowerPoint in a second. And there, if you type in the code, you can join us. We'll be asking you a couple of questions about who's in the room, because we can't actually see you. And you'll be able to ask us questions that we'll be covering in the Q&A session after Eveline's presentation. The presentation tonight will run for about 45 minutes. There's a lot to talk about. And we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A afterwards. If you do want to leave us a question in the YouTube chat function, that's also possible. We'll do our best to get to all of them, but we might not. And there will probably be a question and answer dedicated webinar later this year. So keep your eyes peeled for that one as well. So let's get started with the first Mentimeter question to get you warmed up a little bit. And for that, we have the clicker, which classically does not seem to be working. Brilliant. So the first question, what profession do you identify with most? I struggle to ask people what you do for a job, because a lot of people have flexible interpretations of their job in their field. And today I can see a lot of advocates. That's always good to see. And then split between traffic engineers and transport planners, few urban designers in the mix. Good to see. There will be something in it for everybody, I'm sure. It's not too technical of a presentation and very much focused on the principles, so that'll be good for all of you. And then we'll go to the next. It does work. Second question, what kind of organization do you work for? So do you work for a large municipality with 100,000 or more residents, a smaller municipality, another type of government? Do you work in the private sector? Do you do research, for example, university research institute? Do you work in advocacy, or do you have a different job altogether? And if so, what are you doing here? I see a lot of larger municipalities have joined us today, which is good. Also our colleagues from the private sector, and a lot of professional advocates, which is interesting to see. That's good. Very good. Okay, so while we get that going, the next question is, why are you here? Which aspect of roundabouts are you most interested in? Is it mostly the planning of it, so in terms of transport planning? Where do they fit? Where do they get built? And why? Is it mostly the design? What are the design details that we can use, and what do we need to keep an eye out for when designing these things? Operations, obviously, how do they work? Or do you just want to know it all? Which, not surprisingly, is a very popular option. And spoiler alert, we will be covering all of these topics, so that's nice to see. Great, so make sure you keep this open, because you can ask your questions in the Q&A function of Mentimeter throughout the presentation. And without further ado, I will now introduce you to Eveline de Jong, who will guide you through the rest of the presentation tonight. Enjoy.
Hello, my name is Eveline de Jong, and I'm a designer at Mobycon. So I focus on a design of the public space, road design, but also on traffic safety. So that's why this topic of roundabouts is especially important. So today's objectives are on this slide. So first we will do an introduction on intersection design. So maybe you've already seen our webinar on intersection design. So this is just a quick heads up, or to really show you what normal intersections design is also about. Then we will explore the fundamentals of safe roundabout design, and then apply that roundabout design, the principles on a local context, but also show you what can go wrong even in the Netherlands. So, on the topic of intersection design is very important, because most crashes happen on intersections. So they're the least safe point of an entire network. And also they are the bottlenecks in a network. So you have the traffic safety side of things, that's a problem, but also the bottleneck in the network, so the flow. And that's why it's important to design them safely. And if you want to design them safely for all modes, you really have to look at the most vulnerable road user. So for cyclists and pedestrians, the difference in speed between a vehicle and a pedestrian or a cyclist is way too big in a 50 kilometers per hour zone, while in 30 kilometers per hour, the probability of death is extremely lowered. So it's an exponential growth for probability. So the difference between 30 and 50 kilometers per hour can actually mean injured or death. So that's why it's very important in the design of intersections to really look at how you can slow vehicles down. For example, if you have a junction of two access roads, you want to have the turn radii to be small, so cars really have to take the tight corners, and you have to raise the junction as well, because if you raise it, then they also have to slow down and really look around and see if there are other people already on the intersection as well. When you have a junction of a distributor road and an access road, you really have to look at the point of conflict. So an access road really has the vehicles all mixed together, while on a distributor road, vehicles are separated from cyclists. At the point where they intersect, they all have to interact with each other, and it's best to do that in a slower speed than in a higher speed. So if you have a ramp there, then you can really slow down the vehicles. They can pay attention, look left and right, and see if there's any other traffic coming. And in this case, the cyclist also has priority, so it's especially important to have them in a safe space. And then we have the roundabout design, the topic of today's webinar, and why we build roundabouts and what's very useful about them. That's what we'll discuss in the principles later. But for now, just let this sink in for a bit. Traffic lights are proven to be the least safe intersection option. So we don't build traffic lights to be safe, but we build them for another reason. Traffic lights are a traffic management tool, not a safety tool. So in traffic lights we can have the flow that we want, but we don't have you don't really get the safety that you want. We can see that in the numbers as well. So here you can see in the red the four-way signalized intersection, in the pink the four-way prioritized intersection, and in green the roundabout. And on the y-axis you have the relative number of crashes per junction type. So that means that if you have a four-way signalized intersection, these are over twice as unsafe as their equivalent roundabout. So you can have the flow with a roundabout, but you also have the safety. So that's why we also want to build roundabouts. And why is it that roundabouts are more safe? So we look at the conflict areas for vehicles in this case. So if you have the intersection on the left, you have in total 32 conflict areas, while on the right, the roundabout, you have only 8. So that means significantly less conflict areas. And the conflict areas are no crossings. So you don't have any conflicts of people crossing each other and having a collision on the side. And if you look at this picture, you can see just a normal intersection with traffic lights. But if you want the most safe option, why don't you do this? This also has the same amount of flow, but because the roundabout has separated bike facilities that are in priority, so vehicles have to give way to cyclists. There's even for pedestrians that they have priority. And in this case, the flow is almost the same, while the safety significantly rises. So low speeds. Low speeds, especially in urban areas like this one. This is really a space where the speed is very, very slow, And in this case, it's so slow that we can even mix cars and cyclists in this case. So if you go a slightly higher scale, so more urban area, you really have to separate the cyclists. The speed difference is too big, even with the design of the roundabout. So we want to separate them and give them their own facility. And then this is how it works. So the cars give way to the cyclists that are there and also the pedestrians. And if a car is waiting, other cars can just pass them through. And this means that there's almost always cars that are just going through, while the cyclists can also just cycle. And we can also look a bit at the design here as well. So you have the apron in the middle of the roundabout. That gives a little bit more flexibility to the bus that's coming around the roundabout right now. And we also have a different type of intersection here as well, or at least on the right side you have a more access road. So that's why the access to the roundabout is more narrow, while on the left side it's much more wider, because there is a more distributor road. So it's really a good combination of both types of roads in one intersection. So if you look at outside the urban areas, then you can have the higher speeds. So if you have higher speeds, you don't want to have cyclists in the priority, but you want to have them more further away from the roundabout, so cars can see them as well, but they're outside of the priority. So cars have priority here and cyclists have to give way. In this case, there is a zebra crossing on the left side, which we normally wouldn't do, but we will get into that in a moment. So these are the different flavors of roundabouts. So you have the really urban area where you can mix cyclists and cars. You have the middle ground where you separate cyclists from the cars, and you have on the other side, more outside the urban area, you have to have the vehicles in priority and cyclists have to give way. Now, if you look at capacity, I've already mentioned this. A single lane or roundabout has a capacity up to 25,000 vehicles per day. So if you think that having a roundabout really decreases your capacity, then the numbers really prove that even with a roundabout you can have the capacity that you need while still accommodating cyclists and pedestrians in the safe way that you want. So, in conclusion, why a roundabout? You have 75% reduction of serious casualties, you have better eye contact between the various modes, and you get slower speed for all users. So we have why a roundabout. Now, how do you roundabout, or the principles of roundabout design. So the first principle is to have the bicycle in one direction. So that's the safest option. You have the bicycle goes in the same direction as the car, so the car driver knows to expect a bicycle on the right side and not on the left side. I will talk to you in a minute about what you do if you have a two-directional bicycle facility, but you really want to have a one-directional bicycle facility. So if you look at priority, here the cyclist has priority because it's inside the urban area, and the pedestrian also has priority. So we always have the cyclists on the inside of the roundabout, and then on the outside we have the pedestrians, and this way it's always clear for everyone going to the roundabout that they have to give priority to every mode. So you have to first give priority to the pedestrian, then the cyclist, and then the cars, and if you exit the roundabout, it's the other way around. Then you have to have a good buffer distance. In this case, it's a tiny bit small, but you really want to have one car length, or 5 to 6 meters, to be there in between the end of the roundabout and the cyclist facility. That way, cars really turn all the way, so they are perpendicular to the cyclist track, and they can look both ways and see if there's anyone coming. Then you have to also have enough space between the roundabout and where the cyclist turns off, so you can really predict the behavior of the cyclist. So if a cyclist doesn't want to go the rest of the roundabout but wants to move forward, then it's ideal to have the space as large as possible, because then cars can really predict and can have eye contact between the cyclist and the car driver to really know what they're doing. Then you have the design and the control vehicle. So you design a roundabout for cars, but you also have the control vehicle. So you have a bus or a large truck that also has to make use of the roundabout. But you don't want to have the roundabout as large as to design it for a truck or a bus, because then you get a really big roundabout. But this way, with a rumble strip and an apron, you have enough space for them to maneuver. But for the cars, they usually stay within the asphalt ways, because that's much more smoother ride. Then you have the separation. The separation at the beginning, so the exiting and the entering lane of the roundabout. Ideally, you would separate these two, because then you also have a big overview and you can really slow down and enter and exit the roundabout at a safe speed. So if you look at sight lines, so this is an example which is good and bad. So the good thing is that you can't really see on the other side of the roundabout. So the middle part, the center of the roundabout, is covered with higher greenery. So you can't see to the other side. So it's really a conflict in one direction. So you only have to look at the two side streets, and you can really see only a small part of the conflicts. While on the other hand, you can see on the right side, you have a really big commercial towery thing. So that's not good, because then you can't really see any cyclists. So if there are cyclists coming the wrong way, so they are trying to maneuver the roundabout the other way around, you really can't see them. So that's why it's good and bad in this case. So a very important aspect is also to connect at a 90-degree angle. So if you don't, or if you connect at a 90-degree angle, you really have to slow down. And you really have to maneuver around the roundabout, and you can't just speed through at whatever speed you're going. So if you're going 50 kilometers per hour, you really have to slow down to 30, because otherwise you will hit the greenery in the center, and you don't want that. So if you look at the priority options, so within the urban area, you have on the right side, and outside of the urban area, you have the cyclists outside of the priority. You can really see that the principles of these two are the same. So you have the ground markings, you have the separation between cars and cyclists, you have the raised islands, you have the apron, you have the shape of the bike lane, and you have the vehicle waiting spaces.
Hi everyone, we had a slight mishap. Evelyn was a little bit under oxygenized and a little bit overheating in the studio, so she's sitting down for a little bit, but I can cover the rest of the topic today. You'll see her hopefully back in the Q&A, and otherwise you'll have to join us for the mailbag episode later on this month or next month. So where she was at the examples of various roundabouts from around the world where things do go badly or they go really well, we'd like to take you on a little tour around to show you some of the examples of stuff going wrong, mostly. So first of all, this is an example in the Netherlands. I know that we're teaching you about Dutch design principles for roundabout design, but we don't always get it right ourselves. For example, this roundabout where you can see that there was an on-road bike lane painted in the roadway within the roundabout, and that's actually the worst of both worlds, because there's no space between vehicles and cyclists to separate them, but you're also riding right in the blind spot for trucks, for example, which means that you're at an extra danger of not being seen by a truck driver, and this will cause right hook issues with vehicles turning off the roundabout, crashing into cyclists. So don't do this, even if you can see it on Street View, it's not always good. Then another mixed roundabout right here from Delft. Delft does some great stuff in street design, but this is not their best work. As you can see, there's on-road bike lanes leading into the roundabout, but at the roundabout itself, you're left to your own devices, which is better than having a painted bike lane on the road, but that does mean that you really have to take the speed down, especially on the approaches. You can see there's no safe place for pedestrians to cross these approaches. It's fairly wide, it's asphalt, so that indicates to Dutch drivers that this is a high-speed 50 km per hour area and not the 30 km per hour speed that you really want in these types of locations. It's okay to mix cyclists and pedestrians or cyclists and drivers on a roundabout, but it has to be very low speed. And this is too fast, so don't do this, even if you see it on Google Street View. Then another issue that we see more and more, this is a bi-directional roundabout. Not entirely sure where this one is actually. I think it's Den Bosch, but it is. You can see on the picture on the left that there's arrows pointed in both directions, trying to indicate to drivers that the roundabout is actually traveled in both ways for cyclists. That doesn't generally generate great outcomes because people just don't expect it to happen, and you can add as much signage and paint as you want, but there will be a higher instance of crashes between cars and cyclists on a roundabout like this. There's one caveat though, that if your network really demands it, because the way the bike network is fitted around the roundabout, then it's better to design for it and add all the bells and whistles that you can to try and make it as safe as possible, than to just let it happen without any warning for drivers. So if people are going to do it anyway, there is something wrong with the bike network probably, but it's better to design for it than to ignore it and let it happen illegally. So that's a tricky one. But if you do have a system of a lot of bi-directional bikeways on your streets, this can become a real problem, especially in countries that are not used to these kind of designs. Then a nice international example from France. You can see it's a pretty high-speed roundabout. You can see the design vehicle at the bottom is a huge truck, but that also means that people in normal cars can travel through this roundabout at crazy high speeds because you barely have to do anything in terms of using your steering wheel. And if you don't have to use your steering wheel, you can hit the gas pretty hard, so that makes the roundabout, that takes away the benefits of the roundabout basically, and all you get is flow. And you can imagine the green line swooping around that corner, especially at the exit of the roundabout. The speed where the car is crossing the zebra crossing is going to be too high for safe usage. So that's a big no-no. Then, I find this one hilarious, Columbus Circle in New York. On the right-hand side, it is kind of hard to see, but this was a design done for this crazy roundabout junction system. But they put the cyclist in the middle, circulating the middle island, which to me sounds very confusing because A, how do you get on it, and B, how do you get off it? It's going to be very complicated. New York does have a tendency to put their bike lanes on the left-hand side of cars, so that might clarify why they chose this type of design, but in the end it's not going to generate the results that you want. So try and keep the cyclist on the outside of the roundabout and not on the inside. So don't do that. And then a good example from Cambridge, Cambridge in the UK, and they've recently, 2 months ago, I think, opened their first Dutch-style roundabout. And as you can see, it looks pretty much perfect. It's got all the trimmings, all the things, all the design elements that we talked about today. There's some, to Dutch people, funny markings, but oh well. But other than that, it's working really well so far, and hasn't caused any major disruption, except a lot of attention of press and users saying how great it was. So yes, it is possible to implement bike priority roundabouts in other jurisdictions. I'm not saying it's going to be easy because it does need some understanding from drivers and a lot of communication, but it is possible to do. By the way, this was designed by a Dutch engineering firm. And then just to end it on a lighter note, please keep in mind that while designing your roundabout, roundabouts are supposed to keep things simple. If your roundabout is making things more complicated, like this This is not a render. This exists. You probably might have seen it. It's in the UK. But it is a extremely complex system of roundabouts that apparently works great, but I think it looks insanely complex. So a roundabout is supposed to make things easier and simpler and more intuitive and not make things more complicated. So make sure you keep that in mind while you're designing your roundabouts. So those are a few of the examples from overseas. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, so we'll be changing into our Q&A mode, hopefully. Yes, and we'll be answering some of your questions. Evelyn is back, she's doing fine. So we'll take 5 minutes to readjust the studio, make yourself a cup of tea, and we'll see you in 5 minutes to answer all of your questions. Hello, welcome back to the Q&A session for the Roundabouts webinar. Evelyn is back, so that's good. She's feeling much better having a cup of tea. And we got some very good questions on the Mentimeter from all of you. The first question I'd like to begin with is about the color of the asphalt. You could see in some of the images that we've shown you that the asphalt is very bright red and very dark colored. Evelyn, is it important to have bright red or brightly colored asphalt, or can you just make do with just black asphalt and some paint?
Well, in the case of priority, so if you have priority for the cyclist, it's very important to actually show that they have priority. So you do this by markings and by signs, but the color of the asphalt is very important here as well, because that signalizes that they are actually the one that's going through, while you have to stop and really have to give priority to the cyclists.
Yeah, we use that quite a bit in Dutch streets, right? The same principle.
Yes, in Dutch streets, like on the where you have the access road and the distributor road, you also have the red asphalt that's going through.
Yeah, so. Yeah. So as long as the same principle applies, so people, do you think drivers know that that's the rule, or do they just feel it?
Yeah, it's difficult to say sometimes what drivers really feel or what they look at, but I think it's a very important aspect as well, because the bright red asphalt is quite bright and also really big or noticeable, so that's a really good way to show.
Yeah. Cool. Another question, maybe a little bit more technical, about the design speed, because you talked about design speed and that you want to keep the speeds as low as possible. But for an engineer, they need a design speed to design their roundabouts. And at the exit and the entry, what would be the design speed to design these roundabouts at?
I think normally you would go for the 30 kilometers, but if you really want to have a slower speed, you can also go to the 20 kilometers per hour, but usually it's 30.
Okay.
Or at least inside the urban area. If you go outside of the urban area, it's usually a bit bigger. But
the roundabout is bigger?
The roundabout is bigger, but also the radii are slightly bigger. It also depends, of course, on the type of vehicle.
Yeah.
As well.
So the roundabouts outside the urban area are more designed for trucks as well, usually, or?
Yes, usually they are.
Yeah. Okay, and that means that normal cars go faster?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then about a question that comes back quite a lot about the safety of roundabouts where bikes have priority over where they don't have priority. There was one image that we've shown where bikes have not have priority, which may actually be inside the urban area because not all Dutch cities have adapted them, right? Yeah. But how much is it safer to have bikes in priority or not? And how do we balance those needs?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky because the numbers say that in priority is slightly worse than outside of the priority. So if you have vehicles in priority, it's slightly better. But we want to also be consistent in our designs. And we also want to give a little bit of comfort to the cyclists. So that's why the Dutch national government decided with all municipalities together that it would be better for inside the urban areas to have priority for the cyclists. And that's why if all the situations are the same, so in every town that you come into, you always have priority for bikes inside the urban area, then it also makes sense, and then the numbers, the fatalities or the emergencies go down.
Right, so it's more the consistency that's important, because then people know what to expect when they... Yeah, and that's the same across all Dutch towns, or are there some cities that still...
There are still some cities that are struggling because they have already built their roundabouts with vehicles in priority, and it's slightly harder to then turn it the other way around because it needs a bit more space on the outsides to actually curve the cycleways to have them perfectly circular around the roundabout. So there are some municipalities that still struggle with that.
Because they made a different choice at the beginning and now they have to retrofit, right?
No.
Right. There's a question about the cost. I know that the Cambridge one cost £2.5 million or £3 million. How much is a roundabout in the Netherlands more expensive than traffic lights, or is it cheaper? Do you know?
I don't really know. It really depends on what situation you had before. So if you already have an intersection that only has like two 2 lanes or 1 lane on each direction, then it wouldn't really matter the cost of a roundabout or a larger intersection where you have traffic lights. But if you already have a large intersection, then it would cost more to make it a roundabout because you have to really switch out the entire intersection.
Right. And does that mean that they need buy more land or take more space, or is the footprint, is it very different, the footprint from a protected intersection?
No, if you build a good protected intersection, then the amount of space really doesn't matter. Okay. But if you want to cut corners and make an intersection that works okay, then a roundabout would take more space.
Would take more space, right. There was another question. Oh yeah, is there because you said the bike lane around the roundabout needs to be perfectly circular. Yep. Is there also examples where they're not symmetrical, where you maybe only have bike lanes on one side or not the whole way around? And is that safe? Can we do that?
It is safe, but it really depends on the crossings of the cycleway. So if every crossing is one way, but you have 1 two-way because you already have a bi-directional cycle path because of the network, then that's a point that's slightly more unsafe than the one-directional crossing. So it really depends on the network as well.
Yeah. And speaking of safety, we say at grade, all these roundabouts that we've shown have at grade crossings, sort of level you always meet. But there's also a lot of bigger roundabouts that have great separation, right? Where they have a tunnel or a bridge. The Hovenring in Eindhoven is a famous bicycle roundabout. But is there a specific level where we need to separate them, or is it a matter of how many cars travel there a day, or is it what's the threshold for when you have to separate them?
The threshold really is about the number of lanes. So a single lane roundabout can go up to 25,000 vehicles per day. But if you want to have a higher level of service or more cars, then you need more lanes, technically. So if you have 2 lanes, then you have a chance of 1 car blocking the other and you can't see the cyclist. So that's the point where you grade separate.
Right. So the number of cars is less important than the number of lanes.
Yes.
Because of the crossing distance.
Yep.
Yeah. And even when they're out of priority, it's still...
Yeah, even out of priority, you wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Fair enough. And is there's another question about slowing down vehicles outside the urban area? Because if you have a roundabout there, you still have crossing points. Do we still try and slow people down as they approach those? And what kind of techniques would we use?
I think in most cases we slow people down by narrowing the lane, and also at a roundabout you really, especially when it's outside of the urban area and you have cyclists not in priority, then you really want to separate the vehicles going in and going out. So that's why you also have a bit of a swerve at the beginning of the roundabout, so that also takes down the speed a bit.
So there's no speed bumps generally?
Generally, no, because also speed bumps signalize that you have to give way, or at least in most cases you have to give priority to the other road user, so that could be confusing for the car driver. Mixed messages. Yes.
We don't like mixed messages.
No.
Is there a question about how many legs can you have? Because we've only shown 4. Mm-hmm. Well, most of them are four legs. Can you have 5 or 6 or 7? What's the maximum?
It really depends on the configuration. So you can maybe have 4, but on one side, but you really want to connect them at a 90-degree angle. So depending on how much room you have in between, I wouldn't recommend 2 streets going ahead, like really meeting at the center point, because that also makes it very easy to speed. Right.
So then, if they all have to meet at 90 degrees, the more legs, the bigger the roundabout?
Well,
more
no.
Or less? No, I don't know. Good point.
I think I've only seen 5-way roundabouts.
Yeah.
Not 6-way.
6 is too many.
6 is too many.
Here's a couple of questions about people with sight impairments. Do you know of any? Do they have any trouble navigating a roundabout in the Netherlands? Or is there special considerations that we take into account when designing them?
I think we have the markings, or at least the textured tiles that help. And the difficulty with a roundabout is, of course, that you don't have lights, so you really have to get priority here. Yeah. So that makes it more difficult for people with sight impairments. But with the technical or the tactical tiles, it helps a bit. But I think it's not the most safe option for them. But for the speed difference, I think it is. So right. If you really have a distributor road, then it's the best option for them. Right,
and because they have full priority, right?
Yep.
So they,
yeah. And I think if you have a roundabout where you know that there are going to be a lot of people with disabilities, then if you, or also for safety, it's also better to raise the crossings, and that's also a means that they can travel on one platform instead of going up and down and up and down. Right. That's also a
flush crossing.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you talked about the rumble strips and the aprons on the inside, and generally are Dutch roundabouts, are they flat or are they leveled, cambered? Sorry. So do they sit higher, like a more domey style, and then is the rumble strip in the middle even higher, or is it pretty flat?
I think it's slightly like a dome, but that's mostly because of water. So if you have a rain, which we have a lot in the Netherlands, then it's slightly easier. At least you want the water to be at the end of the roundabout and not on the entire surface. So I think they taper it a bit. Yeah. And then the rumble strips are more tapered.
More tapered, right. So a truck would level out a little bit.
Yeah.
Or level.
A little bit.
Yeah.
But that's also to slow them down.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the truck driver would...
Straight ahead.
Yeah.
Here's a question about capacity, because you talked about the normal roundabout, 25,000. Are there any other solutions for if you have more than 25,000 cars and you still want a roundabout? What other options do we have?
So we have a turbo roundabout. So that's really big then in this case. You also have 2-lane roundabouts, but I'm not really a big fan, or at least as a driver, if I drive a car myself, I don't really like them. And the difference in capacity is only 10 to 20% extra. So if you have 1 lane on the roundabout extra, it's not really that much of a capacity
gain.
Gain. And then if you have a turbo roundabout or a roundabout that has 2 legs going in and going out, then you have significantly more capacity. But then for cyclists, it gets tricky because then you can't really have priority, or you really want to grade separate. So it's better to really look at your network again and see if there's maybe another space where the cars can go.
Yeah, right. Not put them all in that one. No. And maybe it's not a good place for a roundabout. That's also possible, right?
That's also possible. And maybe then you choose to have traffic lights there.
Yeah. Then there's a couple of more questions. Is there an advantage to having a roundabout for a person on a bike? Like what's their key advantage? Because they're safer for cars, and we've talked about that quite a lot, but what about bikes?
Well, they are safer for bikes because of the lower speed here as well. Right. And you have the priority, so that means that you can actually cycle through instead of waiting for a traffic light. And if you don't have traffic lights for cyclists in some countries, they don't have that yet. So then you really have to wait a long time for all the other traffic to continue, and then you can finally cross.
Right. So the full priority gives you a smooth, continuous way. Yeah. People that have been on study tours, I think, will have realized that actually a roundabout's quite fun to ride because everybody has to stop for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's nice. There was one, as a clarification, the 25,000, is that the total number of vehicles, or is it 25,000 per?
The total number.
The total number that travels on all 4 legs combined. Yeah, that's a good. There's somebody who actually posted the link to a roundabout, which we probably don't have time to get into today. One more question about the land, land issue. Does it take more space? Because if you look at it, it looks like it takes more space. Yep. But why does it not take more space than a well-built protected intersection? What's the difference? Like, where do you gain so much space?
Well, for the protected intersection, if you want to make it right, you also have the 5 meter distance on all sides. So between the car lane and the cycle path. So you have the same with a roundabout, and with a roundabout you only have one lane, while for a traffic light situation or intersection with the same capacity, you have maybe 2 entry lanes and 2 exit lanes. So that's why for land use it's mostly the same.
Right. So even though you have the same number of cars, you only need one lane for the approach, and that's because it's
continuous flow.
Right. So you don't have to stop and wait.
Yeah, you don't have to stop and wait, and normally you have 30 seconds for all cars going straight ahead, and now you can just have all the time, or if you want to go straight ahead, then you can just go.
There's no optimization needed.
No, you optimize it yourself.
Nice. Well, thank you very much. Those were some of the key questions of today. If you still have questions that you want to ask, please keep sending them in either through the Mentimeter or in the YouTube chat. We will be organizing a mailbag webinar where we will discuss more of the questions. For today, we have one more question about what the next webinar should be about, and you can see it on the screen right now. You have already voted in large numbers, and I see that most people want a webinar on network planning. All right. Your wish is our command. So we will be looking at that, but I think we can make that work somehow. But speaking of next webinars, we also have something very exciting. The first time you'll hear about it on this channel, and that's that we're working on the Mobycon Academy, for which we have a little introduction movie. And with that, we're going to be letting you go tonight. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the webinar and that you learned a lot about roundabouts. And we hope to see you in the Mobycon Academy from next month. Have a good night.